debt, this is student loans, this is mortgages, this is public debt. This is a debt by cities, by counties, by national governments, sovereign debt. This is corporate debt. This is all the debt issued on debt capital markets, right? All of it. The OECD number is 250 trillion, almost 250 trillion, racing towards that number, right? So if you're thinking about, if you're the global growth guru and your job is to take us from 60 to 305, here's your first problem. You've got 250 trillion in debt that has to be paid back, right? That's 4 years at today's level, right? So part of that has to, if you will, has to go backwards. Now, you might argue, like this hedge fund manager in Dallas, who thinks both France and Japan are going to default on their sovereign debt, that there may be some defaults. But of course, if we have large-scale defaults, that creates a whole different kettle of fish and a much bigger problem. Global productivity growth is declining. Right? So we got a couple of great boosts over the last 30 or 40 years. Here's the first one, right? Look at the number of women in this room. We moved women into jobs. Granted, we have probably a ways to go in terms of the number of women that are running major companies. But there are now, as you know, probably, there are more women in tertiary education than there are men, right? And we got a huge productivity increase. Now, we probably didn't actually get a huge productivity increase because all that domestic work that isn't measured by standard economic models is worth a ridiculous amount of money. And so probably the growth wasn't as big as that. But that was one trend. And of course, the technology. Right, all these technologies that we have that improve that. That growth in productivity is declining. Right? So this is a problem. The Productivity Commission in Australia is now looking at this, and there's a national conference to think about productivity growth in Australia. Aging global population and massive growth in retirees. Japan has a serious problem. Right? They're going to move the largest number of people into retirement over the next 10 to 12 years, and they'll have more people in retirement in 15 years than have ever been in retirement in Japan. Right? The United States is in a similar situation, not quite as many numbers, but they have a different problem. They're underfunded pensions, right? Public pensions in the United States, $800 billion US. So part of the Ronald Reagan miracle was, when he was elected, was to allow companies to access their pension funds and borrow against those pension funds. As a result, lots of companies and cities and public pension funds are underfunded today to the tune of $800 billion. We're going to need growth, right? The amount of growth that you need, right, to cover that is not insignificant. Right? And those people are all going to move out, right? They're still going to consume, but in terms of productivity, there's going to be a bit of a drop-off there as well. Soaring global healthcare costs. I don't know if you've seen these numbers, but the WHO, chronic diseases, those costs are soaring everywhere. As a matter of fact, Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, and Vietnam have said they can no longer continue to support petrol subsidies, right? Keeping petrol prices low for their citizens because, one thing, soaring healthcare costs, they just don't have enough money. The oil price is high, right? Trying to subsidize people so they don't have to pay the world price or a market price for petrol, not a bad idea in surplus, but when you've got other soaring problems that are becoming more and more visible, it becomes a bit of a challenge. Okay, let's look at underinvestment in stationary energy. The IEA estimates that globally, the underinvestment in stationary energy, so power stations, transmission, distribution, all of that, is about 50 trillion out to 2030. In Australia, I don't know if you remember, but Martin Ferguson, the previous energy minister, put out a number and said Australian level investment is about 240 billion to 2030. Right? Now, that may not seem like a big number, but remember, the largest infrastructure project in history is the National Broadband Network, and that's about 40 billion. I don't know what would happen if you took Snowy Hydro and you brought those costs forward in terms of nominal dollars, but it's a huge number, right? Well, we moved from state-owned assets to private assets. The model changed, and the economic incentive to continue investing in infrastructure went away. And as a result, there's a huge amount of underinvestment, right? It's going to be a drag on growth. It's money, well, it depends which way you go and what you invest in. Current global growth is well under 3%. 5% plus is required. Right? So right now, growth is way too low. Right? The United States and Europe, relatively flat. UK doing a little bit better, but globally, IMF says we're just below 3%. Rising fossil fuel prices, risks, and declining energy surpluses. Right? And I mentioned this point about Southeast Asian countries having difficulty continuing to subsidize consumption subsidies. But the real problem here, in my view, isn't the cost, it's the risks. Right? So look at BP and its Deepwater Horizon. Right? We've been operating in the Gulf of Mexico for 20, 30 years now. The level of risk that the company was exposed to was moderate. Right? That mistake, right, that one mistake, almost put them out of business. Right? Right. And the level of risk on a project like that is nothing compared to the Arctic, ultra deep water off of Brazil and other locations. So the level of risk that these guys are exposing them to is unprecedented, right? To the point where you make a mistake and you might find yourself out of the Financial Times list of Fortune 500 companies. Okay. Declining energy surpluses. This is something that doesn't get enough mention, right? Unless you're studying at a good place like UNSW, and you understand that the world doesn't work on energy. The world works on net energy, right? Because every single energy source that we use has to be converted, right? And has to be moved, right? And that process means that there's a certain amount of energy that you need, energy return on energy invested, right? The energy that you get out, right, requires increasingly now more and more energy, right? So that number is declining, and there are people who have attempted to calculate what the minimum sustainable energy return on energy invested is, and there are at least some parts of the literature that suggest that we're approaching that number. Constrained global food production, the FAO just last year said we hit a per capita peak in 2008 in terms of food production. I'm not a food expert, but clearly this is not just simply a distribution problem, and one that's going to constrain growth if we don't get on top of it. Now let's move back. I said let's park climate change.